What do you mean by delivering aid differently?
We, that is Homi Koras, the co-editor of the book, and myself, that the global architecture of aid, which is a $200 billion industry, has changed quite fundamentally over the last decade. It has changed on two fronts. One on the donor side, where the traditional European and multilateral partners have seen growth, but the bigger growth has been coming from new players, such as China, Middle Eastern countries, as well as NGOs. The second big trend is that developing countries have also been differentiated. Some countries became rich, have become donors, like China. Other countries have become poorer and are in big disarray, like Somalia. All that means that you cannot have a one-size-fits-all in the traditional mode of operating in the aid environment.
Let's talk about defining aid, because in a new Africa, where most African countries are growing, aid means something different. It means more technical support. In countries like Tanzania or Malawi, it would mean budget support, but it's no longer the humanitarian aid that many people are familiar with.
No, it's a very good description that you just made. What is interesting, if you take the humanitarian aid and the technical assistance that you both mentioned, both are quite a targeted type of support to try to address a certain need, a certain gap. Budget support is more meant to align partner support to a government's reform program, but that only works if government is committed to reform. So there's still a complementarity of tool, and that's broadly a good thing, because you still need a complementarity of tool in a very variety of country circumstances.
I mean, talking about the world post the credit crisis of 2008, 2009, we've seen, as you said earlier on, less aid coming into the developing world, and we're told that the figures actually, it's been cut by 1/5 because many of the richer nations just can't afford to disburse aid on the level that they used to do before. And because of that, Africans have had to think outside the box, have to come up with other ways of doing business, servicing their communities without relying on aid. And actually, it's proven that there isn't really such a big need for aid in Africa. Is that a right or wrong perception?
No, it's an interesting analysis you've made, and let me respond in two ways. One is there may be a dip in OECD countries' support, but then that probably will recover as well. OECD countries had traditional difficulties to meet their 0.7 GDP target for aid that they have promised for a long time. However, as we say in the book, it is the new players, which make up more than a third already of aid, which have seen the strongest growth and will continue to grow strongly. So the totality of aid to Africa is probably less. However, and that's the core of your question, fortunately Africa has been growing, so there is less aid dependency than a decade ago, although in some countries it still makes a big share of development budgets. But so aid needs to leverage itself into systems. It needs to be catalytic, as some would say, and as we try to describe in the book.
Okay, you keep on mentioning the new players on the aid frontier, and in Africa we've seen China and India in particular coming in, doing things differently, offering soft loans, offering concessions on infrastructure in exchange for commodities. Is this a viable strategy?
Well, it's clearly a bolder way of doing things. It's quite different than the World Bank would operate, because we have much more stringent safeguards and environmental standards we operate with. But broadly, the way I would analyze Chinese or the new players' support is not a simple change of aid to some resources. It's a broader strategy of new countries who have been emerging in the South to create better trade relations across the globe. Mm-hmm. And that's where you see also the biggest trade dynamics in Africa with the so-called BRIC countries. And that's broadly a good thing, because most people have argued that Africa is too dependent in terms of its exports and trades on the north. And if you start broadening towards southern countries, then that's probably, economically speaking, a good thing.
Okay, I'm going to bring in our guest host, Andrew Duvenage now. Andrew, if aid as an industry is about $200 billion, some would argue there's no incentive to curb it or to do things differently. Poverty becomes a business. And yet here we are, modern day Africans, saying enough is enough. We want trade networks, we don't want aid.
I think certainly, and I mean, you know, you mentioned quite correctly, you've seen donor fatigue. You've seen fiscal cuts in markets overseas, and it's very difficult to motivate huge amounts of money with very limited results, as has been historically the case. And so, the catalytic type of relationship that Wolfgang talks about is quite correct, where you can't have this triangle where a lot goes in and little comes out. It has to be the other way around, where you have the efficiencies, and whilst it sounds cliched, sustainability has to be the order of the day. The other thing to look at is in terms of trade relations is, one of the accusations is that China's involvement is very one-sided. It's certainly not benevolent. There's certainly sort of a business proposition there, but for African leaders to actually manage that and ensure that what they're getting out of it, it's well managed and it's long-term thinking.
I mean, Wolfgang, Andrew uses the term efficiency, and I think this is one of the biggest criticisms about aid in Africa, is that unless you're dealing with big institutions, multilaterals, like the World Bank or the IMF, it's not very, very efficient when you start looking at long-term projects of building schools, building dams. That's where the World Banks come in, because these are long-haul investments. You can partner with the private sector, but anything else almost looks like charity.
Well, let me politely disagree with this assessment. If you think back of Africa in the 90s, the big issue was structural misalignments, exchange rate, interest rates, budget deficits, the huge macroeconomic issues. Now nobody talks about those anymore, and in your show you very often correctly highlight the achievements on the macroeconomic fronts in many countries. Now, international partners had a modest role in this, to help governments to come back to good macroeconomic policies, which underlines the growth of the last decade. Second example is, and you mentioned that earlier, is the catalytic element. Look at mobile money. It's been a global product now. How was it started? It was a grant by our partners DFID, who helped through a small competition companies to access that technology, which has been scaled. This is the type of aid that we think should dominate the future of Africa.
Talk to us about the role of development finance institutions, because infrastructure is seen to be that very thing that will catalyze growth and development in Africa, but it needs a big money investments, and those can only come from the AFDB, for instance, from multilateral agencies aligned to governments in Japan, from the World Bank.
Yeah, no, it's a good assessment. It's also an area we are quite active. But the broader proposition again that I would make is, some partners are very good in building roads. I think the World Bank is quite good at building roads and helping governments to establish road systems. And the more countries grow and grow their fiscal position in Africa, the more resources they have themselves to provide infrastructure for. So the trick will be to combine the global knowledge and global financing, cheaper or at close to market rates, and then connect it with government's own financing to establish good system. Because it's not just about building roads. As we know, many roads were built, many now have potholes. The issue is sustainability, as you mentioned before.
Okay, what about the growth of micro-lenders in Africa, tapping into rural communities, smallholder farmers, cooperative farming, to introduce innovations that have been lacking in the market, to try to bring more people into the mainstream? They seem to be playing a more constructive role than aid agencies.
Yes and no. I think you make a fair assessment that the whole microcredit debate, which has been there for decades, never took off until recently, until basically mobile money got to scale in Kenya and is now being replicated in other countries in Africa and around the world. As I said before, it was actually an aid project, a small one, that helped to leverage this. But this is, again, what we want to highlight in the book. If there's one thing people should take away, it's about knowledge. We live in a knowledge world, and also aid will need to live in a knowledge world, because financially it will be too small. And so if you think of the examples you just made, and you could evaluate them in real time and get farmers back information on crop yields and many other elements of their daily lives, which some companies in Kenya actually do, that's, I think, the types of initiatives aid agencies could align themselves with.
And very briefly, Wolfgang, Africa's committed to meeting the targets of the Millennium Development Goals. The work and policy is being driven by governments. Where are the aid agencies in partnering with these governments for fundamental change in education, in healthcare, in sanitation, in gender equity, in democracy and human rights promotion?
Well, I think most partners do that. And if you take the country I'm living in, Kenya, you see in most of the social indicators actually remarkable progress over the last years, and partners actually in both these sectors, health and education, have aligned with government, have helped to make the system more efficient, have actually helped to detect some of the corruption in the system, and so reform it. So there's still lots of problems, otherwise the countries would be rich already, but broadly on this core social sectors, in some countries, there's variance in Africa, things are looking better than one had thought 2-3 years ago.